Good morning. Morning. Listen, if everyone could find a seat real quickly, I tell you what, it's not often that we have a speaker on campus like the speaker we've got today, and I want to be sure and give him plenty of time. Welcome and good morning. We're glad that you're here. For our friends that have come a long way, we know that several folks have come from Central Texas, not close to San Marcos. Thanks for getting up early and driving over. Joining our faculty members who are fortunate enough to not have a class this period, some of our faculty here with us, and primarily our honors students. Raise your hand if you're an honors student. Yeah. We're glad you're here. They get a chance to see what it's like to be in a college class because it'll be a lecture that'll be like they'll have when they are in college. And they'll have one of the best lecturers in the world, not just in this country, that'll be here with us today. So welcome all of you to San Marcos Academy. Today we continue the San Marcos Academy Texas State Distinguished Lecture Series. Today's lecture is entitled C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of a Master Communicator. And our speaker himself is a master communicator. Our speaker is Dr. Stephen Beebe. He is a Regents and University Distinguished Professor at Texas State University, where he serves as chairman of the Department of Communication Studies. He's also Associate Dean of the College of Fine Arts and Communication. In fact, we're pleased to have the Dean, Dr. Mote, here with us today from the same college, Fine Arts and Communication. Dr. Beebe, as most of our students know, because we visited a little bit with them about Dr. Beebe, he is a visiting scholar at Cambridge University. He's taught classes on C.S. Lewis at Oxford University, and his biggest challenge today is to see if he can, in just about an hour, cover what he covers in a whole semester at Oxford University. And we have very bright honor students, and I think that they're up to it, Dr. Beebe, if you're up to it. Dr. Beebe is the author of 12 books that have been used and adopted by over 1,200 colleges and universities around the world. He's president-elect of the National Communication Association, which is the largest professional communication association in the world. He's married to Sue Beebe. Raise your hand, Sue. She's here with us today, a professor at Texas State University in the English department. And the Beebes have two grown children, Mark and Matt Beebe. So now, C.S. Lewis, Chronicles of a Master Communicator. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Beebe.
Well, good morning. Isn't this a beautiful lecture hall? I understand it's been beautifully refurbished, and I'm delighted to be here. But as nice as this is, I really wish we could be somewhere else this morning. I thought about you last week, thought about each and every one of you, when I was in Oxford. And I had lunch with Walter Hooper a week ago. Now, so as some of you might know, Walter Hooper was C.S. Lewis's personal secretary the last few months of Lewis's life. And I've had an opportunity, Sue and I, to get acquainted with Walter. And I always learn something new whenever I interact with Walter. For example, I asked him, so what did C.S. Lewis have for breakfast? I just kind of an odd kind of, but how did, and Walter said, well, he would start his day. I would bring him his tea at 8 o'clock in the morning. And then Lewis liked to fix his own breakfast. He would usually have, he said, eggs, sausage or bacon, and then if the housekeeper had made scones, he loved scones, he would have those. But Walter said what he really liked were digestive biscuits. You know what digestive biscuits are? They're actually little cookies, kind of semi-sweet cookies, but Walter said he would eat those all day. Lewis loved tea. So I wish you could have been with me to have this conversation about C.S. Lewis with Walter Hooper. Walter tells the story. He said, it was the only debate with C.S. Lewis that I ever won. Lewis thought, when I'm gone, no one will be interested in reading my books. Walter said, you're wrong. When you're gone, You have written something that people will remember. No, said Lewis. Our presence here today suggests that Walter Hooper won that debate. So we're to talk about C.S. Lewis. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of Lewis's death. 50 years after he died, his works are more popular than ever. To help me get to know you a little bit, especially some of the students, how many of you here have read the Narnia Chronicles? Have you read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe? Well, if you were in Blackwell's bookstore, the largest bookstore in Oxford, in 1950, here's what you'd see. This is the first edition, published in 1950, of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. That's the book you'd see if you, and maybe if you were fortunate enough to have Lewis autograph a copy. How about how many have read Mere Christianity? Just to have anybody have the sense of that. Screwtape Letters. What about, how many of you read something other than those books of Lewis? Great, great. So, Walter was right. Lewis was wrong. Who is C.S. Lewis? Who is he really? I want to chat with you this morning about 3 questions. Who was Lewis? Why is he important? What is it about Lewis? Why is it that we're gathered here today? What is it about Lewis that made him important? And finally, I can't resist, since what I do in my day job is I'm a professor of communication, I want to talk about Lewis and communication. What is it, from the standpoint of his communication, that made Lewis an effective communicator? Lewis was born on November 29th, 1898. He died on November 22nd, 1963. Does that date sound familiar to you? November 22nd, 1963. He died the same hour that President Kennedy died on that day. If Lewis were here today, if he were your speaker, here's what one person says Lewis looked like. He's something of an everyman, said William Griffin, in that he was just a bloke. Some thought he looked like a farmer. Others thought he looked like a butcher, jowly cheeks, red face, shabby clothes, and he certainly enjoyed a plowman's lunch as much as the next fellow, especially with a pint of cider, a bottle of stout at the Trout. The Trout was one of his favorite places to go. It's about a 2-mile walk outside of Oxford. I had lunch there last week as well, and thought about you and wished you could have been there for lunch, as we would have had this conversation. But he was just one of the millions, says Griffin, one of the millions trying to make his way, his own spiritual way, and it was well known that he wasn't the best map reader in the brigade. He was like all of us. C.S. Lewis was trying to find his way home. He was born in Belfast, Northern Ireland. His father, Albert Lewis, his mother, Flora Hamilton. This is what Lewis says about his family. My father's people were true Welshmen. Sentimental, passionate, and rhetorical, easily moved to anger and to tenderness. Men who laughed and cried a great deal and who had not much of the talent for happiness. And this is what he says about his mother's side. He says, the Hamiltons were a cooler race. Their minds were critical and ironic, and they had a talent for happiness in a very high degree. In some respects, his parents mirror some of his own talents. Some say that in everything Lewis wrote, you can find elements of both his sense of logic and reason and his sense of imagination and creativity. Lewis would trace that back to his own parents. He had a very happy childhood. He said, I'm a product of long corridors, empty sunlit rooms, upstairs indoor silences, attics explored in silence, distant noises of gurgling cisterns and pipes, and the noise of wind under the tile. Also, he says, of endless books. Nothing was forbidden me. In the seemingly endless rainy afternoons, I took volume after volume from the shelves. Lewis loved to read, and that shaped his early life. He had a wonderful nurse who would read him stories. Lewis began writing children's stories. Boxen was one of his first stories. But then when he was almost 10 years old, his life changed dramatically. His mother had cancer, and she died. Lewis says in his autobiography, with my mother's death, all settled happiness, all that was tranquil and reliable disappeared from my life. There was to be some fun, many pleasures, stabs of joy, but no more of the old security, wrote C.S. Lewis 50 years after his mother died. He says, "It was sea and islands now. The great continent had sunk like Atlantis." His father, the death of his wife and Lewis's mother, Lewis's father was not a gifted person when it comes to empathy or caring. Was quite troubled and sent Lewis off to a series of terrible boarding schools. In fact, his first boarding school, the headmaster was declared insane. Lewis would complain, and his father said, "No, you can stick it out." And for several years, Lewis had this terrible education until he was 15 years old, and Lewis's father sent Lewis to see William T. Kirkpatrick. Kirk, or the Great Knock. Kirk, the Great Knock, had also been Lewis's father's tutor, as well as Lewis's brother. Lewis had an older brother, Warney, 3 years older than Lewis. And Lewis remembers the first time he met his teacher. He was picked up at the train station, and his teacher, Kirkpatrick, met him and got in the car, and they were driving. And Lewis casually said, "The countryside of Surrey seems wilder than I expected." And then Lewis says, Kirk said, "Shout! Stop!" And said it made him jump when he shouted and when he said, "Stop. What do you mean by wildness? What grounds do you have for not expecting it?" I replied, "I don't know." He says, answer after answer was shredded, and at last it dawned on me he really wanted to know. And then what Kirk said was, "Unless you've been here before, you have no basis for your expectation. How would you like it if on your first day of class, your teacher asked you, so how was your summer vacation?" "Well," and you say it was fine. And your teacher would say, "Stop, what do you mean by fine? What basis do you have of comparing that with other summers you've not yet had?" That was the kind of experience Lewis had. Or some would have been startled by that. Lewis said, "I loved it. I finally had a teacher who wanted to know what I really thought and took the time to help me develop that sense of logic." He came to Oxford in 1917 as a student. He actually failed the exam to get into Oxford. He failed the math exam. But they let him in on a trial basis. He joined the military, and that's how Lewis got into Oxford. If you join the military, they let you in, Oxford University. Lewis, fairly soon, he would be marching around Keble College, on the grounds of Keble College, and he met Patty Moore. That was to have a major, even though they had a short relationship, it was to have a profound relationship on C.S. Lewis for the rest of his life. Patty and Lewis made a pact. Imagine you making this kind of pact. The pact was, if one of us are killed in the war, the remaining person left will take care of either the father or the mother. Lewis had a father. Patty Moore had a mother. Patty Moore was killed. And Lewis made good on that promise and took care of Mrs. Moore. In fact, he would often introduce Mrs. Moore as his mother. And so that was to be a profound relationship. Lewis was very successful at Oxford University. He earned a triple first. Now, I say that, and no one here gasps. But you know what that means? It would be like, here's what it would be like. It would be like being valedictorian of 3 different classes in 3 different subjects to get a triple first. He was one of the few people in the 20th century to get a triple first. C.S. Lewis received a triple first at Oxford University. Now you can gasp. So that's a little about who C.S. Lewis was. A person, a student. All he really wanted to be was a poet. But he was much more than that. That brings me to my second question is, so why is C.S. Lewis important today? What is it from this 20th century wannabe poet, bright poet, triple first, Oxford, interesting person, what is it about him that attracts us and the books that you have read? You're not alone. in reading C.S. Lewis if you've raised your hand at one of my questions when I ask, have you read C.S. Lewis? C.S. Lewis, his books have sold over 250 million books, 250 million books. He wrote 37 books. His books have been translated into 30 languages. There are 3 stained glass windows honoring C.S. Lewis, one in Texas, one in California, and one at his home church in Headington Quarry in Oxford. In the United States alone, there are 3 C.S. Lewis Institutes, one C.S. Lewis Foundation that has as its goal to establish a C.S. Lewis College. There are over 500 C.S. Lewis societies. There are 2 C.S. Lewis societies in Austin, Texas. Now, maybe there are societies in Austin, Texas of Shakespeare. I don't know. I don't know of any, but I know of 2 about C.S. Lewis. Hundreds of courses about Lewis. The most popular class at Harvard University today is a class about Lewis and Freud, contrasting their 2 worldviews. Over 200 theses and dissertations, hundreds of internet sites, many movies. You've seen the movies of the Narnia Chronicles, some of those out. Have you seen Shadowlands, the movie about his life? Anybody here seen the movie Shadowlands? If you have, the one with Anthony Hopkins and Deborah Winger, then of course you probably know, I'm sure you've recognized that Sue and I are in that movie. It happened to be filmed, well, we are in it. We're only in it for just a little bit. It happened to be filmed the year we were in Oxford, and there's one crowd scene that lasts about a quarter of a second, but we think we can find ourselves in that movie nonetheless. Go to any bookstore today and ask, do you have any books on C.S. Lewis? Go out to Hastings here in San Marcos and look for books about C.S. Lewis. What you'll find is he's not in one place, but in several places. Yes, you'll find him in the religion section, in his Christian apologetics, but you'll also find him in the children's section, the Narnia books, of course. Have you read his science fiction books? He's in that section as well. He's certainly known for his books on literary criticism. Among his most popular books, several of you said you read the Screwtape Letters, published in 1942. They didn't print very many of these. This is the first edition of C.S. Lewis's Screwtape. This is what it would have looked like, newly published in 1942. They didn't print very many because they thought, well, who would want to read a book by an Oxford professor about devils having a conversation? But many people did. This is a copy of Screwtape Letters, a rebound first edition. What's special about this copy is this is the copy of the Archbishop of Canterbury's copy of Screwtape Letters. Geoffrey Francis Fisher, who was Archbishop from 1945 to 1961, first edition of Screwtape Letters owned by the Archbishop of Canterbury. Maybe even rarer than that, and this box is a pre-first edition of Screwtape Letters. What's in here is a publisher's proof, even before it was published, that Lewis or his editor would have used to determine if the book was good enough to go to press. Other books that are popular, Mere Christianity. Mere Christianity, as you probably know, was published in 1952, the first time. First edition of Mere Christianity. This is a British first edition, so it was the first time, this book is the first time his broadcast talks were put together in one volume. But before that, they were published in smaller volumes. Lewis' first presentation was on Wednesday, August 6th, 1941 at 7:45. He was only to do 1 or 2 lectures, but they were so successful. In fact, one person says, I was in a bar, and suddenly I heard this voice. The opening sentence was, have you ever heard people quarreling? I want a bit of my orange. No, I want some of that. And people said they just stopped when they heard this voice come on the air. The person says, I was reaching for something, and everybody just froze. Who is this? What is this? What is he talking about? Lewis had that ability both with his voice and with how he used his words to capture their attention. So those were originally, Mere Christianity was originally published not as a book, but in 3 separate little books. The first book published was Broadcast Talks. So this is a first edition of Lewis's words in Mere Christianity. The second book, Christian Behavior, was the second book. Beyond Personality was the last book published that became part of Mere Christianity. Interestingly, this book was published in 1944 on October 9th, 68 years ago today. The last installment, this book, was published 68 years ago today. In fact, it was said at a certain period of Lewis's life, his voice was the second most recognized voice in all of England. Winston Churchill's voice was first. C.S. Lewis's voice was second. So why do we listen to C.S. Lewis? Well, because he was prolific, and we're here, but what was it? Besides just being a popular writer, I have another theory about why we're here today. My theory is this, we're here today because C.S. Lewis had something to say. It wasn't just his technique, but it was his message. All Lewis wanted to be was a poet. He came to college and he wanted simply to write poetry and hope that they'll be published. His first book of poetry, called Spirits in Bondage, was published in 1919. It's actually, of those who collect C.S. Lewis, it's the rarest book. It's the Holy Grail because it was published, nobody bought it. He used a pseudonym. It was published under the name Clive Hamilton. And so what happened when nobody bought it, the publisher had the remaining stock destroyed. If you were in a bookstore today and you saw a little tiny book of poetry by Clive Hamilton, would you, that must be a famous first edition of C.S. No, and that's another reason why it's so rare. There are only about 10 to 12 known copies in the world. I've seen a couple for sale on the internet. One was listed for $30,000. One was listed for $40,000, because it happened to be C.S. Lewis's first book. And here it is. But this book was signed by C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis held this book in his hand, the rarest book in his collection of books about C.S. Lewis. But that's all he wanted to be, was simply a poet. But he wasn't a very good poet. He tried again. His second book, published in 1926, was called Dimer. Again, it's a long narrative poem. It didn't do very well. It's almost as valuable as Spirits in Bondage. Here's what a first edition looks like of Dimer. He again used the pseudonym Clive Hamilton. So again, if you saw this in a bookstore, Clive Hamilton, a little book, and you started looking through it, and it's sort of, through bearded cliffs a valley has driven thus deep its wedge into the mountain and no more the faint track of the... no, I think I'll pass on this particular book. Many others have. They only published, this happens to be an American first edition, they only published 600 copies of this book. And again, they destroyed most of them, so this too is a quite rare book in terms of those who are interested in collecting C.S. Lewis. I make a point of those books. They didn't sell very well because my argument today is it wasn't until C.S. Lewis had something to say that his writing changed. C.S. Lewis was raised in a Christian home. He went to church, but after his mother died and he was shuffled off to some of the boarding schools, he says he lost his faith and he became an atheist. It wasn't until he came back to Oxford, and he said he just found himself surrounded by other Christians. He said, atheists can never be too careful with who they hang out with, is what Lewis said. In fact, I thought about you last week. In Oxford, there's a long hill on the way to Headington. Lewis would walk from Magdalen College up to his home in Headington, and sometimes he would take a bus. And it was on that hill, Lewis writes this, "I was going up Headington Hill on top of a bus, without words, and I think almost without images. A fact about myself was somehow present to me, and I became aware that I was holding something at bay. What he realized was, I think I have a choice to make. I've been putting this off. I think I have a choice to make." And so finally, after many of his friends, who were also Christians and believed in God, he became not first a Christian, but at least he had a belief in God. He became a theist. He writes this in his autobiography. If you're looking for if you've not read Surprised by Joy by C.S. Lewis, this is The Shape of My Early Life. It's a book written by him that talks about his conversion experiences. He says, "You must picture me alone in that room in Magdalen night after night, feeling whenever my mind lifted even for a second from my work, the steady, unrelenting approach of him whom I so earnestly desired not to meet. That which I greatly feared had at last come upon me. Trinity term of 1929, I gave in and admitted that God was God and knelt and prayed. Perhaps that night I was the most dejected and reluctant convert in all of England." Lewis said it wasn't something that he particularly wanted to do, but he had to do, was compelled to do. It was later, a couple of years later, so he hadn't yet converted to Christianity. It was on September 19th, 1931. He talks about how he and Hugo Dyson, one of his friends, and J.R.R. Tolkien had spent the night, and they were talking about myth, and they were talking about religion. And he puts it this way. Hugo Dyson, stayed the night with me in college. Tollers, J.R.R. Tolkien, came too. It didn't leave till 3 a.m. We began in Addison's Walk just after dinner on metaphor and myth, and then we were interrupted by a rush of wind which came so suddenly on the still warm evening and sent so many leaves pattering down that we thought it was raining." That conversation eventually convinced C.S. Lewis to become a Christian. What he says was that, or here's what he says in his own words. "Now what Dyson and Tolkien showed me was this, that if I met the idea of sacrifice in a pagan story, I didn't mind it at all. And again, that if I met the idea of God sacrificing himself to himself, I liked it very much, providing I met it anywhere except in the Gospels." And he said what he realized that as he was studying myths, that Christianity, as Lewis said, was the true myth. It actually happened. And for him, that was the breakthrough. But still not quite. It was 3 weeks later, his brother, Warnie, they decided to go to the zoo, the Whipsnade Zoo, which is near London. And so if you can imagine Warnie driving his motorcycle, Lewis in his sidecar, Warnie with his goggles on, Lewis with his goggles on, puttering along. They went to the zoo, came back, and this is what Lewis wrote. He says, "I was driven to Whipsnade Zoo one sunny morning. When we set out, I did not believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God, and when we reached the zoo, I did." For him, it was a multi-year gradual conversion. My argument is, it was after that when Lewis wrote, his books took on a new urgency, a new energy. People wanted to read them. His first book that he wrote after his conversion, Pilgrim's Regress, published in 1933, first edition copy of Pilgrim's Regress. That's really an allegory, but tells a story about a person named John that's really C.S. Lewis. So if you want to read about C.S. Lewis's conversion, you can read about it in allegorical form, or you can also read about it in prose form, which is typical of Lewis. Most of what Lewis wrote, he wrote in these two versions. You have a version in prose and a version in poetry or fiction. So I believe we're here today because Lewis had something to say. One of his most famous, I love this quote, he says, "I believe in Christ as I believe in the sun. Not only do I see it, but by it I see everything else." Isn't that tremendous? Or my favorite, One of his most famous orations is The Weight of Glory. If you're looking for just one little gem to read about C.S. Lewis, that's what I would recommend that you read. It was a sermon that he preached at the University Church, St. Mary the Virgin, June 6, 1941. First time it was published in this little pamphlet in 1941, first edition of that publication. It's a beautiful, beautiful message of hope. Let me quote just a few sentences, some of my favorite passages. He says, and I love this, "There are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. Nations, cultures, arts, civilization, these are mortal. And their life is to ours as the life of a gnat. But it is immortals whom we joke with, work with, marry, snub, and exploit, immortal horrors of everlasting splendid, next to the blessed sacrament itself. Your neighbor is the holiest object presented to your senses." Your neighbor, Lewis would say. The person sitting next to you right now, Lewis would say, is the holiest object presented to us. There are no ordinary people. Who is C.S. Lewis? A man, a student, a good student. Why is he important? He had something to say. It changed his life, and he wanted to change the life of others. But I have one more question I want to explore with you, and that is, so why Lewis? What did he know about communication? Mere Christianity was voted in many, many different surveys as the best Christian book of the 20th century. Think how many thousands of books were written in the 20th century. But Mere Christianity was selected as the single best book. Why? What did he know about how to connect with you? Why are you reading him? Why are we here today to talk about him? Well, that was the question that interested me. So I teach a course at Texas State called the Chronicles, C.S. Lewis Chronicles of a Master Communicator. And the first day of class, I give students the final exam. Would you like it if the first day of class, the teacher would give you the final exam on the very first day? I do. I give them the syllabus, and there are two questions that I give students. Here are the two questions. Question number one, what did C.S. Lewis say about communication? Question number two, what did C.S. Lewis do that made him an effective communicator? Like many of you, some of you read Lewis as a child, but I did not. I was new to Lewis. My experience with Lewis came with my experience with Oxford University. It was over 20 years ago. Sue and I were on a bus trip. And actually, that day's advertisement was to go to Warwick Castle in Stratford. And we were going to stop by Oxford for maybe about 45 minutes just to take a look at it. I said, okay, fine. And we went to Warwick, and we went to Stratford, and then we stopped in Oxford. It was a cold, rainy, windy June afternoon when we stopped. I got off the bus, and it changed my life. I don't know why, but I just found myself mesmerized by being at Oxford University. I remember going out and touching the buildings. I remember going up to the Bodleian Library and just putting my hand on it saying, oh my gosh. And then what I said was, I have to find a way to come back here. What is it about, why am I having this experience this day in these few moments on a bus trip in the rain? And so I found a way to come back. And so I developed an opportunity to come back for my development leave, a sabbatical. And Sue and I and Mark and Matt took some time for Trinity term in 1993. And again, I hadn't read much of Lewis. I knew Lewis was somebody I'd heard quoted. Was some guy lots of people like to quote in sermons and Sunday school classes, but I had not read anything by C.S. Lewis. And I thought, well, here I am in Oxford. Perhaps I should learn something about him. And so I picked up a biography of Lewis, and I just found him, what an interesting, fascinating person. Based on that, I thought, well, maybe I ought to read something by Lewis. And that's when I realized, as I started reading him, that he had a lot to say about communication. So I thought, well, maybe that's something I can do. So I went back in 2002, and my purpose in 2002 was to go to the Bodleian Library and look at original C.S. Lewis manuscripts, because what I wanted to find out was, how did C.S. Lewis think? What I really wanted to find is, how did he mark out words and what were his original thoughts? Could I learn something about the way he thought? And I'd gain some insight to the Roman canon of invention that we talk about. How did he develop his ideas? I was very disappointed. Oh, I found his manuscripts all right, but Lewis didn't change much. Lewis made virtually no corrections. I did find out he was a very bad speller, so I kind of identified with him so that was good. And so I was disappointed. So I just started reading manuscripts, and then I read a manuscript that says, in a book like this, it might be expected that we should begin with the origins of language and proceed thence through prehistoric language. I said, a book about language? I don't remember Lewis publishing a book about language. Oh, and it was a manuscript about 8 or 9 pages long, and I said, well, I'm sure it's published. Let me find out where it's published. And I was very disappointed to learn that it wasn't published. At that point, I thought that was a bad thing because now I'll have to read his handwriting and figure it out. So I thought, okay, that'll be my project. So in 2002, actually it took me about a couple years. I would look at the manuscript word by word, try to figure out C.S. Lewis's handwriting. And then on other trips back, I'd go back and go to the library, check out that manuscript. And it was a manuscript called Scraps. It was a little orange book. He'd written the word Scraps on the front of it. And if you turn the book upside down and read it back to front, that's where this little manuscript fragment, I didn't know what it was. Until about 3 years ago. I was, the Shell station out on Ocarina Springs. There's just a wonderful laundromat there. In fact, our washing machine had broken, and so, okay, we have to go do our laundry. Come on, Steve, let's go. So I did. And so I just happened to grab a book off the shelf. So there I was, watching my laundry go around. Then I started reading this book about Lewis and Tolkien were going to write a book together. In fact, Tolkien wrote in 1944, he was going to begin considering write a book in collaboration with C.S. Lewis. The title was Language, and was about the nature, origins, and functions of language. It was advertised to be published in 1950, but it was never published. Walter Hooper says, in the end, it was never written. In fact, even C.S. Lewis wrote this in a letter to one of his friends in 1950. He says, my book with Professor Tolkien, any book in collaboration with that great but dilatory and unmethodical man, is dated, I fear, to appear on the Greek calends. And Greek calends is what Augustus used for the word never. So by 1950, and so I didn't think to look for a book that didn't exist. But then it hit me. That's what I'd found. The manuscript that I had been reading and had spent some time with for the last 7 years was, in fact, the opening chapter of a book that C.S. Lewis was going to write with J.R.R. Tolkien about language, meaning, and communication, the very thing that I do for a living. It gave me new insight. When I went back and looked at it with that new insight, I saw things that I didn't see before. I didn't realize in the manuscript that it says, your authors believe, authors plural. We think. We know the date of that manuscript was about 1948, 1949, about the time Lewis was supposed to be writing this particular book. Lewis had something to say. He was a master communicator. But precisely what did he do? What did he know? What interested him about language? Let me mention 2 or 3 things briefly. One thing, he wrote for the ear and not for the eye. He says, in advice to a schoolgirl, always write and read with the ear and not the eye. You should hear every sentence you write as if it's being read aloud or spoken. If it does not sound nice, try again, said C.S. Lewis. In fact, Walter says when Lewis would dictate letters to him, Lewis would whisper the words out loud. He would say, it has to appear to the ear as well as to the eye. One of the reasons I think we like C.S. Lewis, you and I, if you've read Lewis, is because it's almost like you're having a conversation with Lewis. It's not just words, but it's a connection. One of his most famous books, The Abolition of Man, a first edition, many people consider this his finest book, a book about philosophy. This particular book he autographed to an A.S. Gribble. He wrote them a little note. This is a little note C.S. Lewis wrote, thanking the Gribbles for spending some time there. He thanks them for country air, some eggs, and directions back to Oxford. But this book started out as a lecture, and then it ended up as a publication. Lewis also knew how to get meanings and messages out of people. His stories, his analogies, his use of illustrations. He says, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, he says, it all started with a fawn carrying an umbrella in the snow. He says, it started with a series of pictures in my head. And I said, maybe I can connect these pictures and make a story out of it. He said he didn't start writing The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe about Christianity at all. In his phrase, he said, an Aslan came bounding in to his images. He has that gift, I believe, to also communicate that to you so you see those images in your own mind. Besides writing for the ear and evoking meaning, I believe one of his gifts is what I think the most important thing is about communication, and that is he knew his audience. He knew how to connect with his readers and with his listeners. When I teach public speaking, the first day of class, I say, students, I'm going to tell you the answer to every question I'm going to ask you about public speaking. Wouldn't you like it if your teachers did that? Say, anytime you don't know the answer, here's the answer, instead of playing that 20 questions game that we sometimes play with you. So I say, if you don't know the answer, here's the answer to the question. So the answer to every question about public speaking, I tell students, is this. It depends upon the audience. How long should the speech be? You now know the answer to that question. Should I begin with a joke? You know the answer to that question too. I believe Lewis knew the answer to that question as well. Who was C.S. Lewis? He was a smart person. He was a person that had his own trials, struggles, but was able, and journeys, even the Christian journey, and knew how to communicate that to others. He knew about life and relationships. He married late in life. Joy Davidman wrote to him, and the first letter he received from Joy Davidman was on January 10th, 1950. Joy Davidman was communist, atheist, Jewish, but read C.S. Lewis's book, The Great Divorce, one of his wonderful novels. If you've not read it, that's a wonderful place to read, is The Great Divorce. And from reading that book, was converted to Christianity and wanted to write to C.S. Lewis. Lewis started getting these letters and said, how interesting. And so when Joy Davidman came to Oxford in 1952, she said, can I meet with you, Professor Lewis? And Lewis said, okay. So they arranged a meeting at the Eastgate Hotel. When I teach the class that I teach on C.S. Lewis in Oxford, the day I talk about interpersonal communication, I hold class in that very room where C.S. Lewis first met his wife. That's the day we try to guess which door she might have come in that day. Well, they had a good experience. They met again, and Lewis invited Joy, and she had two sons, to come to spend Christmas with him and his brother Werning. And at that first Christmas, she gave him a gift. The very first gift that she gave C.S. Lewis, not surprisingly, was a book. It was a copy of The Illustrated Man by Ray Bradbury. And she wrote a famous quotation from a poem by G.K. Chesterton. And men may grow weary of green wine and sick of crimson seas. The reason I know that this is the book. Joy Davidman. This is the book. Gave to C.S. Lewis. That started that relationship. So you find in there, Joy Davidman to C.S. Lewis, December 1952. At that same meeting, Joy said, the book that meant so much to me, that changed my life, that brought me to Christianity, was my copy of The Great Divorce. What I'd like you to do is, could you autograph it for me? Lewis did more than autograph. He wrote a couple of fairly famous quotations that Lewis, here's one of them. Lewis wrote this in her book. There are three images in my mind which I must continually forsake and replace by better ones. The false image of God, the false image of my neighbors, and the false image of myself. He also wrote, satire is a glass or a mirror in which the reader commonly sees every face except his own. The reason I know he wrote those words in her book, the book that changed her life. Here it is. This is Joy Davidman's copy. Joy's address, or her signature, Lewis's quotation. Why is Lewis important? He had something to say. His main message, I believe, is that each of us long for something. There's something that we want, and Lewis captured that. In his sermon, The Weight of Glory, he put it this way: "The books or music in which we thought the beauty was located will betray us if we trust to them. It was not in them, it only came through them. And what came through them was longing." Then I love this next sentence. He said, "For they are not the thing itself, they are only the scent of a flower we have not found, the echo of a tune we have not heard, news from a country we have not yet visited." Lewis had something to say. And I believe from studying Lewis, you too can learn how to communicate better. Have something to say. Communicate for the eye and the ear. Use stories, or to put it in the form of a maxim, it's better to get a message out of someone than to put one in them. C.S. Lewis knew that. C.S. Lewis knew it was always about the audience. Who was C.S. Lewis? Why is he important? What did he know about communication? Catherine Linskog, a scholar of C.S. Lewis, wrote this benediction, but it could have been written by Lewis himself. The benediction goes like this: "We are aliens in this land, and we don't know it. Chase us and guide us to our true country. We don't know the way or the real reasons. We are still rude and ragged, but you love us. Bring us safe to our Father King at last." Lewis's goal: bring us home. In this beautiful lecture hall, you've made me feel very much at home today with your kind attention.